thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll try to be quite short in my presentation about very specific topic. I'll share my screen. Okay. Here on the screen you see a stop shot from the documentary Return by Vytautas Damaševičius. It's 1990. Simply there is a representation of a very specific phenomena when in 1989 till 1991, so Lithuanians massively transported the remains of the deported deceased relatives from Siberia to Lithuania, and the means of transportation were very varied from plane organized by different Lithuanian organizations. We see it was already the end of perestroika and national revival. So Lithuanian Communist Party also helped organize a plane to take from Siberia the coffins with the remains of the relatives. But also I talked with some of people who took the remains of their relatives back to Lithuania, and they said that some of them took these remains simply in coffins. They traveled individually to Siberia, looked for the remains, and transported simply these remains in their bags. Some of these remains were transported as post parcels named, for example, as books, and so on and so on. Local people in Siberia helped very much to do all this operation. And so I am going to speak, and this transportation was a finish of injustice felt and suffered, experienced by deportations. And I'm going to talk about this attitude towards death during the deportations, and I'll try to explain somehow, to find the explanation why these remains had to be transported back to Lithuania, although it was sometimes it was very difficult operation. There are some historical facts about deportations. Perhaps not everybody knows that Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, and these first mass deportations took place in June 1941, before the war, a week before the war, and of course there were much more deportations planned, but the war started. And at that time, more than 70,000 people from Lithuania were deported. And it is important to say that mostly families of elites, women, children, but the men usually were taken to camp prisons, and the women were taken to to Siberia, to the South Siberia, and a year later also to the north, to Vorkuta and other regions not very good for living. And the next wave of mass deportations took place in 1948, 1949, and mostly there were families kulaks, because in Lithuania the processes that of collectivization started only after the war, and they were mostly people who had land property and were quite well-doing farmers, and also people who support anti-Soviet resistance. And so we have quite a huge number of people who were deported. Quite a big part of them died in Siberia and other areas, but quite many of them returned, and in 1987 when also in the Soviet Union, the processes of rethinking of Stalinization started anew one more time. Also in Lithuania, the deported people started to write their memoirs and to send these memoirs to publish. And they were not only deportees, also, of course, there were also some camp prisoners who survived. And so there were a huge amount of memoirs published at this time, 1988, 1995, and the society had a huge interest into reading it, into reading all these memoirs. And afterwards, this wave of interest to memoirs some dropped down, and but anyway, their experience was integrated into this national narrative, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. My research interest, common research interest, is death politics of the Soviet state, but most in Lithuania, of course. So about rituals, practices, meaning of death, and this topic of deportees and experience of deportees and camp prisoners is only a part of my bigger project, and but it is a very interesting part, because I can research in their emotions, I can research in their narratives, they present their attitude to death. And also I find this topic that is important also for this conference, about the understanding of what is the dignity of death, and what is proper death ritual, and how they made efforts to somehow to create these proper rituals in impossible situations. My research is, I place my research in some frame of several theories. It is a social constructivism approach to death. That means that these rituals and even feelings regarding death have cultural, social roots, and also sometimes these rituals, or not sometimes, but perhaps usually, they serve as means of moral and social and other control of individual, of strengthening of the community, and so on and so on. And I also look at this, another theoretical ground is the idea of the Soviet regime as a specific political religion that created or generated a specific political religion. But of course, every political regime generates a specific political religion, where some lives and death are more important than other lives and death. And perhaps this the Lenin's body is much more important than the body of the deportee person. It is quite clear. And also that there are politically, in Soviet regime, we also have these politically constructed collective rituals and feelings, which also served to the purpose of transformation of society, strengthen the patriotism, and showing what is the good life and the good death, and what is not good life and not good death from the perspective of the Soviet state. And also, it is important for me, these death modernization theories about the change of the concept and practices of death from the traditional to the modern. It is important also in Lithuania very much, because as far as I see, this very traditionalist ideas of pre-Soviet ideas of death rituals they were faced with the institutionalization and change attempts of the also Soviet Lithuanian authorities to change, to simplify, to remove the death from the family environment into the society's environment, and so on. So from these three approaches, we can speak about the place of the deportees' lives, perhaps. I call, yes, there is another slide, of course. Yes, what was the policy of modernization when we see in the Soviet Union? Of course, perhaps there is also a possibility to look at the treatment of Lenin's body from modernization perspective. But there were many different attempts to modernize, to implement the cremation in the Soviet Union, Lithuania. It was also there were attempts to build a cremation house, but didn't succeed because it was clear that there will not be a big interest of population over that. And also this modernization was expressed by a simplification of typization of typical gravestones and a specific planning of cemeteries like parks and so on and so on. That was quite in contrast to what was traditionally usual burial or treatment of the dead ones before the Soviet regime. And also what is important for me and also for this presentation is this hierarchization of death according to the extent to which the life of a particular person was devoted to the goals of the state, socialist society, the ideal of communism. We had also in 1974 the death of Lithuanian Communist Party leader Antanas Sniečkus, and I also researched in his burial rituals as an exemplar ritual that was of the highest hierarchy of the importance of death and life in Lithuania, and this was the distinction between valuable and worthless life and death was very clear. And of course that the deportees and camp prisoners found themselves at the lowest level of this patriotic hierarchy of death, and their lives and death had very low positive or social significance. And from this perspective, and also what was very important in Lithuania was atheization policy, perhaps because of big importance of Catholic Church and meaning of Catholic traditions to the society. So there were constant efforts to reduce the impact of religious rituals and the religious meaning of human life and on society, and to replace them. But as far as I see, for the deportees, this atheization policy was not so much important because paradoxically they were not in Lithuania. When they died in Siberia, especially after the war, the burial with the Catholic traditions was much, I could say, much more available and freely made than in Lithuania itself. So I look at this case of death and life of Lithuanian deportees and camp prisoners from this perspective of policy of modernization and policy of patriotism. And I am not sure 100% that this that the naturalization of death could be attributed to the modernization. That means that death as a natural fact and dead body as simply the body that should be got away or should be sent, get rid of the that the authorities or people responsible should get rid of it. But anyway, this rituals of burying the bodies in Siberian deportees camps were organized, bureaucratized, and it somehow it could be interpreted as a case of extreme modernization or extreme modernization attitude towards death rituals. So this traditional understanding of death that was brought by the deportees somehow clashed with this state death practices that were implemented in Siberia, and the memoirs themselves play the role of a testimony to the inhumanity and or abnormality of attitudes towards death in Siberia. And also, and I'll speak about that a little bit more, also attempts to resist the anonymity of death of the loved ones were very important during in these deportation camps, and also the return of the remains to Lithuania as a ritual act of restoring a proper relationship with the death. And the dead is also, I see also as this contradiction of traditional understanding of death of the deportees against the state death practices. So I have some quotations from the memoirs about this abnormality of attitude towards death. The deportees themselves name that these practices are abnormal, and we should understand that it is mostly about mass death, periods of mass death, not so, and perhaps also some mass death after directly after the war, during the war, but in 1950, starting from the Stalin's death, when deportees stayed still in Siberia, the death practices started to get more or less normal in their attitude. So these mass death and burial ceremonies, first of all, the deportees tell that the dead were written off the officers of the camps, and said that they will easily write off dead deportees. And in camp prison, they tied some table with a number of the deceased, only, but not the name. It was the number of the deceased and not the name, and that was very shocking for these camp prisoners who speak about these practices. And of course, during mass death, the bodies staked in piles lie for a long time. They are not buried. Coffins are slapped of junk wood, or they are buried also without any coffin. And what was also shocking for the deportees that the relatives could not themselves bury their loved ones, the exception was made for the burial of the children, and there were brigades organized to bury the deceased. And usually these brigades were too lazy, and they didn't dig the graves, but they put the dead under the ice in the water in the river, and this river took, of course, these bodies to the ocean. And also, these camp funeral rituals were very pragmatic because they tried to the guards wanted to be sure that the dead man is a dead man. So and all this was very very shocking. For deportees, the graveyards in ice was in all memoirs, perhaps was there is a talk about the graveyards in ice, and that the bones in ice cannot rest in peace because the burials are not deep, and also that the sea slowly is washing and destroying these graves, and the coffins are falling into the sea. And also when the Lithuanian deportees are talking about cemeteries, abandoned cemetery, they name that these are abandoned cemeteries, although for the local people, the situation is quite normal. So perhaps there were also cultural differences between these Lithuanian deportees' attitude towards death and cemeteries and the local people. And these cows and susliks in the cemeteries are also usually mentioned. And all these cemeteries as a desecration of graves. So also there are emotions. I'm not going to talk about these emotions much, but there is not only sadness, but also indifference in the face of all this mass death every day, and usually they didn't have any resources, even to any physical resources, even to somehow to have a proper emotion towards the dead ones. And there are also some efforts against the anonymity of death recorded in the memoirs, and they usually are stressed very much that against this anonymity when there was no mark left at the burial site. So so sometimes the deportees tell that if there was an acquaintance, so they tried to tie on the tomb the name, not the number of this deceased, not only the number of the deceased, but also to write the name of the deceased. Of course, this writing was in coal or something, but it was a kind of very important gesture for these people who were acquainted to write the name. And also the relatives tried to mark, to make some sign where their loved ones were buried, even when they were the mass graves. And some other cases when they marked with the cross, they tried to write the name, but also another efforts, for example, to organize a little bit more proper ritual and to make it at any cost. There was a story about a hunting rifle that was very important in the life in Siberia, but the woman gives to a supervisor to make a coffin for her husband, and also girls make some funeral wreath from rags, from nothing, but it was very important to have this funeral wreath. And another phenomenon is that some people, some deportees tried to write down names of the deceased, somehow to keep this memory of them. But usually these diaries, they destroy these diaries because of strict supervision by the authorities in the deportation places. But this gesture was very important for them to write the names and to keep the names. And also, what is important that after returning from exile, the deportees go back to Siberia to build cross. When they returned from Siberia, usually they took the plans of the cemeteries or places where their loved ones were buried, and afterwards they returned and tried to give some mark there. And what is important for Lithuanian deportees, and it is difference between Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian deportees, and perhaps it is some cultural differences, that I find this notion of a homeland or idea of homeland that is very important for as structuring narrative of all this talk about death and survival, and about also this returning of the bodies of the dead to Lithuania. This homeland is understood as a sacred land of living and dead Lithuanians. And of course, it is in Lithuania. And this suffering and death are explained as things that happen because of the forced uprooting from the homeland. You suffer when you are uprooted from homeland, and eventually you die. And the return of this harmony of life and restoring this some justice, perhaps also, is only is associated only with the return to the homeland, and not only of living people, but also of dead, of the remains of dead people. And because the dead must lie in their own land, in their own ground of the homeland, and the remains of the dead people cannot rest in peace in Siberia or in other places. And it was this idea of ancestors that are resting in homeland is very important. So there are some quotes I would like to give you. Siberia is, itself, it's seen as a foreign land that is unwelcoming even in death. And usually the deportees remember that they were somehow horrified, not only from this life in the deportation places, but they were horrified of the idea or thought that they will die there, that they will die, that they will stay there forever in Siberia. And usually the dying deportees, they requested their relatives to get them back to Lithuania and to get their bones back to Lithuania. It was like a final testament given to the relatives. And there are also many cases when people try to escape Siberia and explain that they, especially sick people, they try to escape from the camp or from the deportee places and explain that they want to die in Lithuania, to die not in Siberia. And so the returning to the native land becomes this greatest dream of the deportees. And the living or surviving people, they understand that as a commitment. Then there are some rituals in memoirs. When they go to Lithuania, they go to cemeteries and they promise that they will get back the remains, and also they were the deportees who survived and deportees who died. They were somehow convinced, or they had this idea that there is a kind of ultimate necessity to be buried in Homeland, and this returning of the bones of loved ones after 1989 somehow was understood as carrying of the will, and but from the society living at the time in Lithuania, it was not very accepted, not always very with very big support, because it was treated somehow as a necrophilia or something like that. But from the people, from the former deportees, it was a very important act. So I'll show you some another stop shots from the same film. It was constructed very specifically, but you see here in the upper right side there is a woman with a map, so a map, it is an abandoned cemetery, and this woman is looking for her mother, trying to orient herself in this this forest, so many years, some 40 years passed. So, but she was of course a girl when she was in deportation, and they dig the graves and select the bones. And here is the photograph I already showed you. It is a photograph of coffin, and they try to decorate, to give a proper dress to the bones and skeleton of the found bones of the dead ones. And how did they recognize that they were bones of their relatives? Usually by crosses, rings, or something like that. And here, the last photograph you see, it is already these coffins in Lithuania, brought to Lithuania, and there was a ritual organized, kind of national mourning ritual that was understood as a proper burying, proper funeral ceremony for these deceased in Siberia. They didn't have any proper respect when they died, but now they are respected properly. And so there is a quote from this film. That woman wanted to bring, is very happy to be able to bring the bones of her mother to Lithuania. And I show, the film was not in color, it was documentary, but I wanted to show all this ceremony with national flags, national costumes, of course, and also priests here. Of course, it was already another story about how these bodies and lives, especially bodies of the deported people, were inscribed into new national narrative that was used for this for consolidating of nation in this independence movement. But perhaps yes, there is already quite another story, but very interesting one also to use these bodies for making new national collective identity that was very important for new political identity and new political visions. So it started already 1988 and later. And so some of conclusions about perhaps bringing back of these remains of deceased one. I see that as a kind of phenomenon of personalization of life and death. As I said already, not all the expeditions were organized officially by the Lithuanian organizations. People simply they bought themselves train tickets, plane tickets, and individually traveled to Siberia to gather to find the remains. So it was a kind of attempt to personalize the death after so many years, to give this funeral with proper ritual, to give their own grave and tombstone. And there are stories that a woman, she couldn't take the remains of her mother from Siberia, but she took some ground from her grave, and afterwards in Lithuania she was allowed to build a tomb also in cemetery in Lithuania. So it was a kind of symbolic tomb. She reunited in the symbolic way her remains of her mother with the Lithuanian land. So it was very important, this connection between person and homeland, and that's why also to reconnection of these deceased with the ancestral community first of all, and these ideas perhaps are not very Christian, but anyway they function in the society. And also it is important that this also reflects the transformation of patriotic hierarchies in this new context of national patriotism. The bodies that were on the lowest level of this state religion during the Soviet times, they started to play the role of the very important role of a new political religion and new political state in the highest hierarchy. So for me, it was very important, this change of hierarchical position of the same same bodies. So thank you. That was. I don't hear. I don't hear you.
Right. Can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I hope we'll be able to deal with the echo. So, Nerija, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. Once again, we have to be mindful of the time, which means that we have 15 minutes for the discussion, and I would be very happy to take questions or comments either from the audience here in Potsdam or through the Q&A on Zoom. Who wants to go first? Susan. Yes, please do.
Only if nobody else wants to go. Thank you for your presentation. I was just curious to know whether you've done any thinking about repatriating bodies in other countries and other cultures. and how the Lithuanian desire to be buried in the homeland, was sense that it's tremendously important to be buried in the homeland, whether that contrasts with the same desire in other cultures.
Thank you. It's a very good question. I didn't. As far as I can, I made a comparison between Latvian and Estonian understanding of these connecting narratives. But thank you for the question. I think it is very important. My research is ongoing, so I perhaps yes, it is very important to look at these other cultures and other cultural understanding. But as far as I looked at some of them, there is not such an important stress upon this reunion with the ancestors. But I can't make any conclusions of comparison. So.
Okay, now?
It's very important for religious Jews to be buried in Israel even after generations. I know that there are indigenous tribes of Native Americans for whom it's terribly important to rebury the bones on ancestral lands. So I'm just curious about whether there was something particularly Lithuanian in your discussion or just general. But
Okay. I didn't research till now.
So yes, Frédéric has a question.
It's about the image of bones that come out of the permafrost when it is unfrozen. Is it something that comes more regularly with the perspective of climate change, or is it something that has always been there in the narratives you collect?
No, it's not a climate change. It is simply that you dig very hollow holes to bury dead ones, and in the spring, yes, the ice melts. And all this remains comes to the surface of the earth. So it's simply this understanding that this kind of procedure of nature shows that the land is not accepting the dead souls. It's quite a symbolic understanding. It's nothing to do with climate change.
So I have a question of my own. You can hear me, right? So you mentioned quite briefly, actually, the contrast between Lithuanian and Estonian attitudes. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. So is the point that you're making that for Lithuanian deportees it was especially important to be buried or reburied in Lithuanian soil, whereas for Estonians it was not that important? And if that is the point, would you explain that with reference to the Catholic versus Protestant traditions of those two countries? Or do you think there's something more to it?
I would yes. This concept of homeland is characteristic for Lithuania. In Latvia, in memoirs of the Deportees, there is concept of destiny. Bėdos has made the investigation. And so this reunion with the remains of the dead ones is not so much important with the land. In Estonia, we also have this idea of destiny, but also there is idea of homestead. That means bigger stress and importance of living ones to come back, but not so much of the dead ones. I perhaps have to explain with the late Christianization of India. Not because of Catholicism, but of course in Lutheran tradition or Protestant tradition, attitudes towards body and the bones of the dead ones is different as to the Catholics, who have this cult of the saints and exposure of remains and so on.
Right. I mean, I was speaking this morning about the Italian ossari, which are essentially, and there are Austrian cases as well, which I think are based on the same principle, that you have to be buried in sacred ground, and the sacred ground is limited. So this is so important that you will even take older bones out so that new corpses can be buried in the sacred ground, and maybe that has something to do with it. But the other question I had, unless someone else wants to go, is about the sort of the identification that is required for repatriation, because in the first part of your talk, you seemed to suggest that a lot of the burials were actually anonymous. And I'm not sure whether there was a significant difference between deportees on the one hand and camp inmates on the other hand, because I imagine that for deportees, even in special settlements, it was still, a little easier to actually bury their dead than for people in camps. But still, I mean, it seems that in both cases, a lot of people were buried anonymously, or their remains were disposed of anonymously. So what does that mean for efforts to identify and repatriate the dead in the late 80s and early 90s? Can you maybe articulate it as a percentage of people who were successfully identified? Were there a lot of cases where people were searching for their relatives and couldn't find them? And was there kind of, a divide between people who successfully managed to repatriate the bodies and others who just didn't know where their relatives were buried?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I researched in memoirs and did not made any comparison or statistics or some. There was not so much a big difference between the burials in deportation places and camp prisoners during the war, before the war, because the mass graves were mostly destroyed and the remains were rushed to the sea, or they were left in the mass graves. But anyway, there are these symbolic acts. For example, you take some ground from the places where you imagine your people were buried, and you take it to Lithuania, make this symbolic act, and also the remains of some of the people and this national funeral also played as a symbolic role. That the deportees are deported. They are not necessarily my relatives, but they symbolically they represent this return to Lithuania. So of course many people they did not took the remains of their loved ones, mothers, fathers. Because there was a huge amount, 40,000 or more died during the first years of the deportation. And in camp prisoners, almost everybody died at that time. So. But anyway, these symbolic acts are very important.
Thank you. Yes, Małgosia. Yeah, we have time for one more.
Hello, Nerija. Thank you very much for touching, interesting presentation. I would like to ask you. My family was living in Vilnius before the war, and part of the family was deported. I never spoke about this. They arrived, and they were deported in 1941 with this great wave of deportation. And I would like to ask you, as I understand, within in the name under the label Lithuanian Deportees, also there were Poles and Jewish who were living in Lithuania, and if yes. Because now I understand it's important for Estonia and Lithuania as a national symbolic act of rehumanization. But if there were any situation where Poles or Jewish were asking Lithuanian state to be a part of this dialogue with reburying or rehumanization of the human remains, or it became a state, Lithuanian state commemoration action. So, if there is any division between these deportees?
It's a very important question. There were some 3,000 before the war. 3,000 of Polish deportees, about 3,000 Jewish. It's from 21,000 of all deportees till the beginning of the war. And the fates were different. The Polish deportees were returned after a year. Most of them, because of the treaties. I don't remember now. Jewish deportees, of course, lived together with the Lithuanians. And all these national celebrations, of course, it is based on ethnic Lithuanian and strengthening of ethnic Lithuanian consciousness. And this is the idea of fixation of the nation. And there are research about some memoirs of Jews and Polish people in places of deportation, but there are few. And these memoirs, they were published mostly exceptionally by Lithuanians, because Lithuanians were encouraged to publish memoirs during this time. So yes, of course, there is a kind of, as I said, new political religion. It formed the expectations for nationals. I don't know the memoirs of Polish deportees from Vilnius, but perhaps there are some.
So we have one question on Zoom from Heike Winkel, who asks, can you elaborate a little bit on the legal basis of the reburials? Were there any agreements on a national basis? And I'm assuming she's referring to agreements, for example, between Lithuania and the Russian Federation, or any sort of treaties regulating these activities, or was it entirely self-organized?
At that time, there was regulations. Simply, these delegations, they get some agreement with the local authorities. And local regional authorities, not with the Russian Federation, because at the beginning it was the same state. Later, there was an agreement with the Russian Federation about the expeditions to the cemeteries to build crosses, but it was not the reburial anymore. The reburial expeditions ended with the end of the Soviet Union, mostly. But at that, but during all these expeditions, there were no any normal legal rules. It was very anarchic situation, especially when I hear when people spoke to me, how did they organize all these personal expeditions? It was somehow incredibly crazy, I could say.
Thank you. It's a really fascinating case, and I have to admit that I didn't know anything about this before listening to your lecture. Somehow it's never really.
I can't hear.
Okay. Cor, can you turn on the? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? No. Can you hear me?
I hear the sound, but it was very weak.
Better now? Now?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I was just thanking you for talking to us about this fascinating case, which I admit that, you know, as someone interested in you know, the politics of death and burial and reburial, I was absolutely unaware of, especially these really striking examples of people, you know, sending parcels across the Soviet Union. So I think it's a really wonderful contribution to our discussion. Unfortunately, we have to break now, not least to prepare for the next talk. Irina Skokina was very strict time constraints, but join me please in thanking Nerija once again for her talk.